Western governments don't really have a problem with political Islam. They have a problem with what they label nowadays extremism, which means we don't want you to bomb, undergrounds and buses in London, or bomb buildings in New York, which is outrageous and huge human tragedies. But it's okay for you to have Sharia law in Iran, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and elsewhere. So, for example, you see in this war on terror, Iraq has become more Islamic than it was in the past. And Afghanistan is an Islamic state. And if you Google just Sharia law in just this past few days, you see, for example, that the British government is actually setting up Sharia courts in Afghanistan, as if it's not enough that they already have Sharia law as the law of the land in Afghanistan. Just in case some people don't want to go to the Sharia courts that are set up by the Afghan government, they're setting up informal ones as well. Very helpful of them. So, in a sense, you see that it's, this whole, this is why I have such a problem with the anti-imperialist left, nationalist left, and I hate to call them left because I'm on the left myself, and I believe that the left is the banner carrier of social justice throughout centuries, the working class and the left. And, the fact that they see political Islam as a anti-imperialist force, well, even their anti-imperialism is so half-baked, because in reality, if you look at the contemporary history of political Islam, you see that it was brought to center stage by Western government policy vis-a-vis the Cold Belt during the then Cold War, and particularly in Iran as a response to the rise of the working class and left movement during the Iranian Revolution, which was not an Islamic revolution, but is often labeled as such. And so in that sense, I think, it's putting on blinders and not really fulfilling its role in defending people's rights. I always give this example. It's sort of like, because I'm against the Islamic regime in Iran, then I should be pro-US militarism. That's the logic that this left has. If you're against US militarism, then you can be friends with its enemy, which is political Islam. But in reality, political Islam is not really the West's enemy, Western government's enemy. Some of its closest allies, like Saudi Arabia, is a very, very close ally of Western governments. And also, when you look at the situation in Iran, they have problems now and again on the nuclear issue. You never hear about human rights and about what's happening, the 30 years of cruelty and inhumanity imposed on the people in Iran, as well as many other countries. And so in that sense, I think that we need to really start rethinking and standing up to the fact that it's racism to criticize Islam and political Islam. It's not. And in fact, I think given the havoc that it's wreaking and the untold human misery that it's creating, that it's a task and duty now of progressive people everywhere. And also, I think what happens is, if you don't start with the human being and their rights and their freedoms, I think you can go very wrong. Like this nationalist left, which is, anti-imperialist, so they'll be in bed with the political Islamic movement to the extent that they'll raise the flag of the Islamic regime of Iran in their demonstrations. They segregate, Stop the War Coalition meetings in Britain, men and women. I mean, sexual apartheid is one of the outrages of our century. It's like racial apartheid in South Africa, but based on gender. Intolerable. And there was a time when racial apartheid was also excused, and they had scientists coming to explain how black people have smaller brains than white people, and how Bantustans are great because they've got their own areas, but they're separate. They're equal, but they're separate. And in a sense, the political Islamic movement and its sexual apartheid, these are the sorts of justifications we're hearing today. And I think we need that sort of mass movement that will push it back and say, look, I'm sorry, it is intolerable in the 21st century for men and women to be segregated. It's intolerable for children to be veiled and segregated from boys, not allowed to have sunlight on their bodies, not allowed to play and swim with their friends. And it goes to the extent where in Iran, for example, they're talking about limiting the hours that girls study because they don't need as much education as boys. Or changing the textbooks that girls read because they don't need to have the same information as boys do. And I think these are just, the continuation of what Sharia law means and what it brings for people across the world. And I think it's something, and we have a responsibility really to address it and to stand up to it. And I think it's not so black and white. We can be opposed to political Islam and opposed to U.S. militarism. And in fact, I think that's the principled position to take. Because I'm against political Islam, I'll stand up to the right wing that is vilifying Muslims, is vilifying immigrants, and is trying to use they suddenly talk about themselves being, a feminist. The right wing now have become feminists. And it's amazing because they impose their Christian morality day in and day out in society. They won't allow funding to go for AIDS research, stem cell research. They're against welfare mothers. They're against sex education in schools. They think homosexuality is a perversity as well. And here they are talking about the rights of women in the Middle East. And their solution is get rid of all the immigrants that have come here because they're bringing political Islam to the West, to Judeo-Christian nation. And what I always tell them is, listen, the reason we have any rights in the West is because of progressive left social movements, working class movements that have pushed religion back into the private sphere. It was an enlightenment. It's not Judeo-Christian values that gives us freedom of speech, that gives us equality. It's despite those traditions and because of an enlightenment that's pushed it back, that allows us to have the freedoms that we take for granted. And we've got to do the same with political Islam. We've got to push it back. A reformation isn't enough because even the Christian Reformation just meant a changing of hands of power, a changing of power in different hands. It was enlightenment that brought a lot of the things that we take for granted today, and we need the same against political Islam as well. So I think that's why it's really important to decide what one believes in. If you want to put the human being in the center, hold the human being sacred and nothing else, then I think it becomes very easy to say the anti-imperialist nationalist left have it all wrong, the right wing have it all wrong. There's an alternative that actually is opposed to both and that represents a vast majority of people across the world, and I do believe it represents a vast majority across the world. I think it is important because, oftentimes people say, well, Sharia law in Canada or Britain, well, it's not really my problem. I don't have to go to them. You don't have to go to them. That's me, because I'm an atheist. I'm not going to go to them. So what are you worried about? If people want to go to it, let them go. And then when you start talking about Iran and Iraq and elsewhere, that's, well, that's their culture, that's their beliefs. And I think, if, in a sense, September 11th and 7/7 in London and elsewhere shows how much it's not over there only. And it's a question of rights, isn't it? I mean, if you have vast segments of a population in the West living with different standards, different rights, different norms, it diminishes the rights and standards of everybody living in this country. But also, it's a duty. I mean, I guess we could have said, well, what do we care about what happens in South Africa? What do we care about what happens in Palestine and the Israeli slaughter of people of Gaza recently, for example? It matters because it matters to all of us. We're all involved in various things. And so political Islam is something that is affecting everybody's lives. But also we have a duty to stand up to it. And I think we need to start pushing back the things that stop us from standing up to it, which is very often, the fact that it's considered racist to do so. And I think, actually, it's quite racist not to do so. It's quite racist to think that, all these people actually want to be stoned to death and want to be sexually segregated and want to have less rights